So welcome to another episode of Planet Possible. We are delighted you're joining us to hear evidence-led discussion about the topics that are critical to the way we manage our water and environment. A huge thanks to our season sponsor, Atkins Realis, and you'll hear a little bit more about them later. We're really grateful for their support in bringing the pod to you. If you're new to Planet Possible, I'm Niki Roach. I'm a passionate advocate for all things water and environment and a fellow of CIWEM, the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management. CIWEM members in over 90 countries are professionals with a breadth and depth of expertise in the topics that are shaping the future of our planet, and we're joined by many of them across the season. Public interest in our environment, certainly here in the UK, seems at an all-time high, and there's a real focus on how our waters are managed. People are definitely engaged, and there are really strong feelings about the health of our rivers and the waterways that flow through our landscape. And whether those challenges come from agricultural runoff, sewage spills, or urban and diffuse pollution, many people want to see action and help drive improvements. So, in today's episode, we're exploring one way people can and are getting involved through citizen science. We've got a fantastic interview coming up with Sasha Woods, Director of Science and Policy at Earthwatch, and Michelle Walker, who's the Technical Director at the Rivers Trust. And to help us understand what citizen science is and navigate the topic, I'm joined by a fantastic co-host and Chief Scientist of the Environment Agency, the environmental regulator in England, Dr. Robert Bradburn. So welcome to Planet Possible, Rob. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
It's lovely to be here, thank you.
So let's get started by asking a really obvious question, and I've hinted at it, but what is citizen science, Rob?
The Environment Agency uses science in lots of ways to support its work, and I've got about 1,700 people who say that they use science pretty much in their everyday work. And that might be to look for future challenges, it might be to help support our operations. And importantly, it's also about understanding the environment that we're living in and understanding that water environment especially. And citizen science is where groups or individuals of people from really diverse backgrounds across the country who aren't specifically linked to organisations go out into the environment and do some experiments, take different measurements and try to understand a little bit more about the environment around them.
And where does it sit alongside the role that you have as the Environment Agency in monitoring and enforcement?
I've got lots of people who do science in the agency, but even that number of people doesn't give us enough people to be able to see the whole of the environment. Our environment's really complicated and it's really varied, and it's one of the most wonderful things about living in England. But that means to really understand the complexities of our environment, you need to have as many observations as you possibly can. And that's where citizen science can really come in. It's a fantastic opportunity for the Environment Agency to involve citizens in getting data collected and in doing research. And it can really complement the more scientific and professional research and data collection that we do ourselves.
Thanks, Rob. That is a great introduction, and I'm really keen to hear more about how the agency are using citizen science. But before we do that, let's hear from Earthwatch and the Rivers Trust and how they're using citizen science. So here's the interview with Sasha Woods and Michelle Walker. Let's get started by understanding a little bit about your two organisations. So Sasha, tell me a little bit about what Earthwatch does.
Earthwatch is an environmental charity with science at its heart. So we're all about promoting nature connection and providing people with the tools that they need to fight for the planet. And we do that across three main environmental areas: nature in cities, farming with nature, and then also fresh water.
And Michelle, can I ask you the same question in the Rivers Trust, please?
The Rivers Trust is an environmental charity as well. We're the umbrella body of the Rivers Trust movement in the UK and Ireland. We've got 65 member trusts who in their river catchments are all working in partnership with local communities, with businesses, with farmers and landowners and government to really tackle some of the many issues that our rivers have. And a key thing is that Rivers Trust don't own any land, so they have to pull people together around data and evidence, so looking at what the issues are and what's driving them, and then look for multiple benefit solutions. So these are often nature-based solutions, things like wetlands and tree planting and remeandering and working with soils. And that's the work that our member trusts do on the ground, and we as an umbrella body support that through some of the tools and resources and funding that we can direct their way.
Great. And so much overlap between your two organisations, but also some points of difference, which I'm looking forward to getting into. Let's get started then by understanding the role that citizen science plays in both your organisations. So Michelle, if I come to you first, how do the Rivers Trust use citizen science?
I mean, it's a really fundamental tool for us. So only 15% of our rivers are in good ecological health. So we've got huge issues out there, but there is a real dearth of data. The statutory evidence base, the government evidence base is full of holes. Our State of the Rivers report has a real deep dive into that. And so our member trusts and the local communities that they're embedded within have always tried to fill those gaps with local data and evidence. And, we've got some fantastic examples around the country of great schemes, things like the West Country Citizen Science Investigations programme that's got hundreds of volunteers out filling those knowledge gaps and getting to know their local rivers. We layer that up together, so we have our sort of tier of citizen science that's accessible to volunteers, but then we have maybe some more keen volunteers that get involved and fill out even more knowledge, and then we have our staff within the member trusts as well as the professional data from government and water companies and others. And it's really trying to combine all of that together in a weight of evidence approach. It just underpins how we plan and deliver the work that we do, and also how we monitor the effectiveness of those interventions and those nature-based solutions that we're delivering.
And what kind of things are your volunteers, those members of the community, collecting when we talk about citizen science? What do we actually mean? What kind of data?
For rivers, that could be a real variety of things, because it's not just things that you might think about first, like testing for the chemistry of the water and the water quality, but it's things like what's living in there, so your freshwater insects, invertebrates. It can also be things like algae. We've got some initial work going on at the moment looking at citizen science methods for that. But also it's your bankside issues, so where are the pathways that pollution is entering the river, and it's much wider than that. It's things like invasive species. We have volunteers out recording where we've got invasive plants, but also then your land use and your soils as well. We've got some really good innovative methods coming through now to look at how we can monitor soil health, because it's not just the river channel, it's the wider catchment as well. So it can cover a whole range of things, really, from the physical habitat, the water quality, biology, and the wider sort of landscape and land use.
Sounds like the best geography and biology field trip ever combined, is what that sounds like to me. It sounds joyful. And Sasha, from an Earthwatch perspective, you're doing things similarly but slightly differently. I'm keen to understand sort of the same question. So where are Earthwatch using citizen science at the moment?
Earthwatch is a real champion of citizen science. We think of it as a tool across our programmes. We talk about citizen science as being science by the people for the people, partly useful for engagement and education for the individual, as well as then collecting and analysing data to support scientists. So it's this two-way relationship, really, I think, citizen science. So in our Nature and Cities programme, where we're planting tiny forests, the clue very much in the name as to what that involves, tennis court-sized forests. Citizen science is used to engage people, connect them with nature, and then also study the socio-environmental benefits of this nature-based solution. With our freshwater programme, it is about collecting enough data to support official monitoring frameworks, and also to provide people with more information that they can then use to advocate for their freshwater.
So I'm keen to understand impact. So I guess I'm kind of asking why. Give me a sense of where it's been effective, where it's driven change or improvement. Michelle, can I ask you first?
At the moment, we're working, and Sasha and her colleagues in Earthwatch are involved in this project called CASCO, the Catchment Systems Thinking Cooperative, and we are looking to really sort of upscale what we can do with citizen science. And we've got demonstrator catchments around the country where we're really kind of investing in coordinating and improving the way that citizen science can have an impact. And some of the examples from that, we've got one of our demos over in the Anglian region where volunteers have been out monitoring water quality on small headwater streams that have had no monitoring before. There's just been no government sampling there. Through their work, they've actually been able to pinpoint where some of the phosphate issues are coming from, and Environment Agency, because the data have been improved and benchmarked against lab tests, so cheaper tests that the citizen scientists are using. We understand the error bars and the uncertainty in the data. That's given the Environment Agency confidence, and they know the level to which those volunteers have been trained, and they've been able to engage them all along. And they've been able to go out and follow up on some of those potential sources, which includes water company sewage treatment works, but also septic tanks as well. And we've actually, in the septic tank example, where householders have had visits and been reminded they need to do that sort of maintenance, the volunteers have actually been able to record improvements in the river already, and that's really satisfying, that closing that loop. And we've seen other examples around the country, the CSI programme in West Country, having those eyes and ears on the ground, spotting problems early and being able to report pollutions, which has led to a successful prosecution by the Environment Agency. The Riverfly Partnership, we've got lots of examples of where those have spotted problems early. You know, it's that eyes and ears on the ground is really critical here, I think. But also Thames region, we've got the Outfall Safari project that Zoological Society of London run, and they get volunteers out monitoring and surveying polluting surface water outfalls where the sewage and pollution is entering the rivers. And about 70% of the surface water outfalls that have made it into Thames Water's upgrade programme have been identified by citizen scientists. So there's some really great examples being teased out now. And I think the more we can share these and inspire each other around the country and show what's possible, the greater impact we're going to have.
Just a follow-up that might be a little tricky, but I'm interested in whether you think citizen science is filling a gap that should be filled by those organisations that are responsible, not just water companies, but, you know, we've talked about agriculture, householders. So those organisations that should be responsible for the health of the environment in which they discharge into, for example. Is it filling a gap that should be filled by them, do you think, or is it helpfully additive?
It should be additive. There is definitely a gap. You certainly shouldn't be using citizen science as a cheap money saving thing. It's not about cutting costs for your monitoring that has to be done anyway. It's all of the other things that you can gain from that. It's engaging people in understanding about the health of their rivers. Sasha's colleagues have done some brilliant work on the pathways to impact for citizen science, and we use that as a real guiding thing with all the work we're doing, which is, it's not just about providing a bit of data that you can plan your actions. It's then about all the other things that people start to do when they get engaged in this. It's writing to their MPs, it's becoming a more informed consumer, it's organising locally to drive environmental improvements, you know, volunteering to get involved in their river restoration activities, individual behaviour change, learning about your power as a consumer, as a water company customer. So there's so much else that we can get out of citizen science, but you absolutely need to have better investment in statutory monitoring, and it can't be used as a gap filler.
You just talked about pathway to impact. So Sasha, if I ask you from an Earthwatch perspective, where is it effective in the work that you're doing?
So our Great UK Water Blitz, we ran one in June and we just had our latest one in September. And in terms of this pathways to impact, we ask our participants at the end about their involvement in the environment prior to taking part and whether they feel that they improved their understanding. We get really positive feedback on, you know, around 40% of people had no involvement in the environment sector before they took part in our blitz, and you're looking at like 60% of them improving their understanding of water quality issues and having a positive shift in their relationship with nature. And that's the kind of thing that triggers this positive behaviour change that Michelle was talking about. Simple things like not chucking wet wipes down the toilet, through to bigger things like writing to your MP, changing your relationship with water and how you treat it.
And what is your Water Blitz? You mentioned it there, but for listeners that haven't heard of it before, give me a quick summary.
Yes, and haven't taken part and desperately should.
Okay.
Yes, so our one in September, it's using our Freshwater Watch programme and our kits. So it's measuring the concentration of nitrates and phosphates, which are good indicators of the water quality. They're problematic because high levels lead to the process of eutrophication. So you get algal blooms, high levels of bacteria, low levels of oxygen. It's really bad for plants and animals in the water. And our Freshwater Watch project, generally, it's a global citizen science project. It's been running for around 12 years. We have over 40,000 data sets of nitrate and phosphate pollution across the globe. But for our Great UK Water Blitz, we run it over 4 days. Anyone can sign up and measure the water quality of their local freshwater bodies. So it's not just rivers and streams, but also ponds and lakes. Back in June, we had just over 2,500 people take part and collected 1,300 measurements. In September, we had over 4,500 people collecting 2,300 measurements. So it builds up a really great nationwide snapshot of the health of fresh water that can really complement the monitoring that's taken part by the Environment Agency and other regulators. It's been really useful in terms of assessing pollution dynamics. The weekend that it took part was horrifically wet. It was biblical rainstorms across most of the country, and our citizen scientists donned their waterproofs and their brollies and still went out and took part. And that was amazing because you're evidencing that nature connection, that people care, and collected a really powerful data set demonstrating where the best and worst water quality is across the UK.
I will put a link in the show notes to the Water Blitz, and also we talked about the Rivers Trust Big River Watch as well in one of our previous episodes, so I'll pop a link to both. And the nice thing there is if you're in the UK or overseas, it sounds like there's things you can get involved in, which is wonderful. I want to ask you a little bit about unintended consequences. It's one of my favourite questions in general. Are there any unintended consequences of citizen science? Michelle, if I come to you first.
We certainly see some issues that we need to focus on, and we need to figure out how we deal with them. One of the biggest ones that we're focused on is the expectations of citizen scientists. I mean, you mentioned Big River Watch. That's our sort of national entry-level citizen science scheme that we co-designed with partners on the Casco project. And it's really trying to get people started on their citizen science journey. So we had 60% of participants who'd never done any citizen science before, and it's fantastic because we can now point them at the next thing that they could do, you know, whether that's Earthwatch's Blitz or, you know, their local Rivers Trust or whatever. Because people don't understand maybe the dynamics of river health and the time frames involved and the way that catchments can influence river health all the way sort of downstream, people could be very impatient to see change. So if they've recorded a pollution on our Big River Watch app, they want to know, well, why isn't it fixed already? And I think that is the challenge that we as organisations that engage citizen scientists really have to rise to, is how we can start to explain that and boil down what is really complicated catchment science and quite frustrating politics and organisational framework behind it about why these things take so long. So that's something we really try and do. And, you know, we've got volunteer coordinators in each of our demo catchments, and that role kind of sits a lot in our member trust that raise funds locally to do this. And they're the ones who have to really engage and explain to people that just because you've reported something doesn't mean that it'll even get acted on, and even if it does get acted on, it could take a long time. So I think there is something around managing those expectations. But also, one thing that we're really trying to do with Casco is to bring some discipline and organisation to how you plan citizen science to have an impact. So rather than just a local group going, right, I can see a problem here, I'm just going to grab a water quality kit and go and test the water, and, you know, why hasn't someone done anything about it? It's actually sitting down first collaboratively with the people who you need to influence with that data and evidence, understanding what the issues are and developing a collaborative monitoring plan. That's what we're trying to do now, and that plan should say, what's your hypothesis? What is it you're trying to test for before you go out and decide what monitoring approach is the right one, and before you then go do it. Because if you don't start with your objective in mind, how are you going to analyse that evidence and know what it's telling you? So it's trying to bring that discipline, and that sounds complicated, and it is complicated. This is what we're trying to figure out on Casco. It's an innovation project. We're trying to figure out what's the right proportional way to do that without creating yet another plan that sits on a shelf and doesn't get used. But that actually means we don't have just sort of a vigilante approach where people just go and test the water quality and then start naming and shaming farmers for polluting, when actually the organisations that could do some real good with those farmers, that could start to find the win-win solutions, now won't be allowed down the farm track because we've sort of started from a very adversarial position. So it is really tricky managing some of this, that time frame that volunteers want to see action versus the time it does take to use and influence this data. And I think that's where sharing some of those case studies where you can generate impact quickly and look for ways that you can make change is really important.
I mean, it's so interesting, isn't it? We have spoken a lot on previous episodes about the double-edged sword of campaigning, because actually, in general, it's moving things along probably faster than it would do ordinarily. But there is a risk around setting unrealistic expectations and of creating an environment that can be quite tense. Chris Packham, the interview that we did last month, talked about the importance of kindness and patience whilst also driving for change. And I thought that was absolutely perfectly put, really. It's about both, isn't it? Sasha, if I come to you, same question from your perspective. And obviously Earthwatch are working beyond freshwater as well. In your experience of citizen science, have you come across sort of unintended consequences?
I mean, with some of our bigger projects, so we work on a EU-funded project called More for Nature that is all about using citizen science and citizen science-generated data for environmental compliance assurance. So that's promoting policy, monitoring towards policy, and where appropriate, enforcing policy. But we have case studies in areas in South America where enforcing policy can be quite dangerous. And so I think there can be some unintended consequences in that space. I mean, it's quite far removed from what we're talking about in the UK in the freshwater space, but I think it sort of relates to that relationship management and the expectations of your volunteers. I think citizen science, because it's so collaborative, you do have to be careful with, we're in conversations with the Environment Agency. There have been relationships with water companies, with farmers, and it is about treading that fine line where you don't want to be pointing fingers and you want to be bringing everybody on this journey towards environmental improvement together without alienating anybody and also alienating other citizen scientists. I think citizen science, because it is people volunteering their time, it typically attracts a very similar looking group of people of a certain age and other demographics. And I think an unintended consequence can be that if other people of other backgrounds are not seeing themselves represented in the citizen science space, they can begin to feel further alienated from what's being done. And so I think there's a real need to engage very diverse groups of people, because otherwise an unintended consequence is that you are alienating people further from nature.
Yeah, democratising data is one thing, but making sure it's done really equitably. Michelle, do you want to come back in?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point there about, the diversity. And one of the things that we have tried to do over the last couple of years, we've been working with Birmingham City University, which is one of the most diverse universities in the country. And we got their engineering students. First of all, they helped us test out the very first iteration of Big River Watch. And we got young 20-year-old lads in inner city Birmingham to go out and test the survey. They ripped it to shreds for us. It was great. It was a really good road test of what language we need to be speaking and how we can engage people. But we also got the students designing some citizen science soil monitoring kit for us as well, and coming up with ideas. It was run as a competition, and we're going to build on that this year. So it's trying to find ways that you can use the work that you're doing elsewhere to go and engage a different audience. But one of the things, I don't know if it counts as an unintended consequence, but I think it's a really interesting bit of work that's been done by UKCEH around the health and well-being benefits of citizen science. We've heard a lot about the health and well-being of being out in green and blue space, but they have got hard evidence that actually nature noticing activities, in other words, going out and asking someone to go and count butterflies or measure water quality, that has an even greater benefit for people in terms of their mental health and well-being. And I think that's fantastic, but it does mean that if we are going to extend this, we've got to make sure that we are reaching out to the communities that need that most. And, things like social prescribing, green social prescribing schemes would be a fantastic way that we could really grow citizen science, I think, and help people's mental and physical health, as well as filling our knowledge gaps.
And that's the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, is that right? That's where
yes,
the reports come from.
sorry,
yeah, brilliant. We've talked about social prescribing a few times on the pod. In fact, on our mini pod, Joe Caird brought a study recently around the benefits. I think 8,000 people have been surveyed, and there was a marked improvement in mental health. But Joe made the point that you've just made, Michelle, which is that, and Sasha actually, that you've got to be able to have access to that space to be able to benefit from it. And often the people that need that access are the ones that find it hardest to get there. So it's a real challenge, but it's great to see the positive impact it can have, and then it's just filtering it through. That interface between nature and healthcare is a really interesting one. Our 2024 season of Planet Possible is supported by one of the leading engineering and design consultancies in the world, Atkins Realis. Here at Planet Possible, we bring a diverse range of voices from across the international water and environment sector to explore how to tackle some of the biggest challenges we face. And that aligns perfectly with the Atkins Realis purpose of engineering a better future for our planet and its people. We're really grateful to Atkins Realis for enabling us to bring another exciting year of Planet Possible to you. I want to kind of bring us back to rivers a little bit, because we've thought a lot about rivers on the pod over the last 12 months in particular. What are your reflections on the current state of our rivers in the UK and specifically the role of citizen science in that kind of landscape? So Sasha, maybe if I come back to you first.
I'll talk a bit more about the blitz that we did recently, just because we partnered with Imperial College London to do a wider chemical analysis of what's in our rivers. They use a technique called liquid chromatography mass spectrometry, which is just a very fancy way, it's a very complicated way of separating out all the chemicals and assessing how much is in the water. So we're still analysing some of the samples that have been coming in from the blitz, but of the 90 or so that have been sent in, predominantly from England, ultimately it'll be across the UK, caffeine is found in 100% of the samples, and at concentrations which could pose some risk to aquatic life in 80% of them. That's just caffeine. So we already know from our Freshwater Watch monitoring that our rivers are stressed out through nutrient pollution. Then you add caffeine, which actually we don't really know what caffeine does, but we think it adds a level of stress when rivers are exposed to temperature change and other things like that. We found antidepressants in 30% of samples, painkillers, nicotine, also fungicides, pesticides. So we've got a real cocktail of chemicals swirling through our rivers from all sources of pollution, really. So the state of rivers is not good, to put it very bluntly.
That's fascinating. I mean, I'm saying that as somebody who is cradling my cup of tea, and I'm regularly cradling a cup of tea, often decaf. I hope the fish appreciate it. But that's so interesting about all the things that we don't measure that you're measuring and what that then might mean. Gosh, opens up a whole world of further questions, really. Michelle, if I come to you as well from a Rivers Trust perspective, and obviously you've done your big river watch. So what is your sort of take on the state of rivers in the UK at the moment and citizen science's role in that?
It is not good. The last few years we've published a regular update to our State of the Rivers report that really takes that statutory evidence base but adds in layers of information like the studies that Earthwatch and others have done. We've done some work with York Uni as well, looking at the chemicals issues in our river, and we know that not a single river that's been sampled in England passes the minimum standards, and that's where there are standards. So it is a pretty grim picture. But what we do know is that the only way we're going to be able to turn around the health of our rivers is by working together. If you've got money over here that's being spent on reducing flood risk and money over here that's cleaning up water quality because the water companies want to extract it for drinking water, or that they need to reduce the impact of sewage pollution, and you've got biodiversity money over here that needs more habitat, climate change money and so on, you can't have an impact unless you club everything together and start planning it at a catchment scale. And that's where we really see citizen science as part of that pyramid of evidence being really key. And a couple of examples we've got that really inspire me about what could be possible if we scale this up nationally. A few years ago in the Eden catchment up in Cumbria, there was a whole partnership of organisations led by the water company, by United Utilities, but involved the Environment Agency, our member trusts, Eden Rivers Trust and others, the National Park, lots of partners and local authorities. And they, by collecting a really solid evidence base, including citizen science as part of that sort of framework, they were able to show that actually, rather than just spending millions of pounds removing phosphate from a few sewage treatment works. If you spent that upstream in the catchment, tackling things like septic tanks, but also agricultural pollution, and investing in nature-based solutions, that you could reduce the flood risk. This was just after Storm Desmond had decimated Cumbria. But you could tick so many of those other benefits as well, improving the water quality, improving biodiversity, capturing carbon. And that's what we really need to see. And, another really fantastic urban example of that is one of our member trusts, Thames 21, working with Enfield Council in London. They had flooding issues in the catchment, but they also had huge water quality and biodiversity problems. And they worked with Oxford University and the local community to monitor the water quality across the catchment, then identify through the modelling opportunities to put in urban wetlands. Local community then sense-checked that and sat down with the modellers and actually ran different scenarios to see, if you put a wetland in here, what would the flood reduction be like and what would the water quality improvement be like? And I think that's the key point of that. Citizen science doesn't just have to stop at getting people out taking samples. You can really engage people in the whole scientific process. And it was a really exciting case study, I think. And I'd love to see us doing more and more of that and really engaging local communities in making decisions about their localities.
So, final question for you both, and you know what's coming because I ask all my guests this. I'm going to pass you the Planet Possible magic wand. Sasha, I'll pass it to you first. Give it a wave. If you could make anything possible in this space, what would you want?
I would want citizen science data to be incorporated into official monitoring bodies. I just think that the data that they're capable of collecting is so robust and, can be collected at nationwide scale. And the sooner we start taking that data seriously, I think the easier it will be to start pinpointing hotspots of pollution and creating solutions to problems like Michelle touched on there. And I would like to see nature-based solutions implemented as a first resort rather than a last one. I just think that they are so powerful and just completely underused. That's sort of two waves of the wand there, but that's what I'd do.
I'll let you have them both because they're good ones. Brilliant. And Michelle, how about you?
I can't just say what she said. That sounds pretty good to me. What I'd like to see, Casco is running for 3 years and we are testing out what can we do if we try and nationally coordinate and improve the quality of citizen science, drive some standards, give those organisations that could use that data to underpin billions of pounds worth of investment and spend it in a better way on those multi-benefit nature-based solutions. How can we really drive that if we improve the quality of the data? And I would like to see that turn into business as usual, properly funded, properly resourced, but not removing the ability for that local control and creativity, just properly resourcing that, having volunteer coordinators in every catchment across the land that can motivate a whole diverse range of volunteers to get involved. And we just want to see those really brilliant examples popping up on a weekly basis of how citizen science has really started to turn the corner and fix our rivers rather than just watch them getting worse.
Some really inspiring next steps from you both. That's great. Thank you so much for joining us on Planet Possible.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Rob, so what are your initial reflections on what we heard from Sasha and Michelle?
I think my first reflection is I'm just delighted that in both cases, there's a real focus on getting people out into nature and really engaging with it. I think, as we heard, there's some really good science that shows that actively participating in citizen science really makes you connect in a way that other activities in the environment doesn't necessarily do, and actually changes your behaviour and makes you often do more positive environmental things for months after you were engaged in that project. I think the other thing that really is positive here, and I see this in the two reports that they referred to, is that both groups are going beyond simply saying get out and take a couple of measurements. They're really thinking about how to construct these monitoring programs, how to support and use the wider data that might be available from other sources, and how to link that all together. And I have to say, I've looked at some of the outputs from some of these. For example, the Rivers Trust dashboard that they produce, and they're really engaging too. So that gives a really positive feedback mechanism for those who got involved.
We heard from Sasha and Michelle that there is quite a lot of rigour around this process, which I would imagine is quite reassuring from your perspective. How does the Environment Agency connect with citizen science data, and how do you manage, I guess, the risk that might come with different levels of data capture, data quality and assurance?
You go out to collect data for different reasons, and actually understanding what you're trying to answer and why you're going to the place you're going to really makes that data much more powerful, because then everyone can see exactly where you were going, why you were doing it, and how you were doing it. By adding those layers of data to the actual results, it makes it so much useful for other people to be able to reuse and repurpose that data. So what we've been doing in the Environment Agency for the last couple of years is we've been supporting a citizen science project which has put individuals into all of the local areas around the Environment Agency to start working with the local citizen science initiatives in all of those different areas, recognising that different areas have different groups who are doing different things. And the brilliant thing about that project is by having people out in those individual areas, they've been able to come back together and to share that learning and to say, oh, over here they're doing this and this is really good, and over here they're doing that. We're starting to build up a much more detailed understanding of what makes for really robust, solid citizen science, which we can then use in our operations. So that's been a really positive thing, and we're just starting to harness some of that learning within the agency.
It's great. I mean, it's great to hear that it's starting to find a way in. It sounds like you're finding your feet and learning alongside some of those groups, which is sometimes a really healthy way to do things, I think, isn't it, really? It's not that you've got all the answers, but that you're kind of working that path together.
Exactly. What was said in the interview, I think, was really telling. I think it was when you asked the question about, are there any downsides to doing this? Our friend from the Rivers Trust was talking about the problem sometimes when people go out and they take a result and then they're on the phone the next day to say, why hasn't this changed? Why hasn't this had an effect? Now, giving feedback to citizen scientists is really, really important. No one likes to go out, spend a day, you heard, in sometimes really bad weather conditions, go out and collect this information, and then nothing's done with it. So feedback's really important. But there are a number of ways that we're looking to improve the water environment, and that might be through regulation, it might be through enforcement action, as we have to do sometimes, it might be through actually building new bits of habitat, and we have people out trying to recreate sections of river and put in nature-based solutions. These things are going to take time, and one of the things that I have found really insightful is looking back at some of our data that we've collected over the last 30 years and just showing how when you put in a big intervention, like many years ago when we changed the way that wastewater was treated, how long it takes for the rivers to feel that change and to change in their biology and chemistry in relation to that. So things don't happen immediately. And that's why we need to keep working with the citizen science community to increase their capacity to help us, to increase our ability to use their data, and really to help everyone to understand, as the Rivers Trust were saying, that we're working in catchments, we're working in systems, and we really want to improve those whole systems, and then we will get better outcomes for people and for nature.
I think that's really important, actually, about patience. In our last episode, we interviewed Chris Packham and he talked about patience quite a lot. I think there's a juxtaposition between the kind of sense of urgency that I think many people, whether you are a campaigner, whether you are working in the field, feel about wanting quick improvements, but also recognising that we're working with natural systems that take time to recover. Your point around the data showing how long things have taken to recover in the past is a really important one, isn't it? And helping people understand that, so it doesn't just look like you're delaying or ignoring, but actually that it just takes time sometimes for things to get better. So we've talked a lot about the water environment, and that's a very hot topic here in the UK, certainly at the moment. But from an Environment Agency perspective, Does citizen science start to play a role in any other areas of your work?
Well, yes. One thing that citizen scientists are really, really good at is looking at the plants and animals around us in nature and taking really detailed recordings of those. And it's an area where for many years different parts of DEFRA have relied on a huge volunteer army, if you like, of people out who are really keen to understand how the animals, the insects, the plants, etc. are changing around them. And that data is really important to the Environment Agency. Again, we've heard about catchments and about the fact that what ends up in the water very often starts on the land, and also how the water flowing through a catchment really changes the animals and plants that can live there. And so we do use that biodiversity data in some of our operational work, actually, to help define how we work with different companies who are operating in those different places and how they can understand the sorts of pressures that they might put on the plants and animals that are around them. So absolutely, we use different data from different citizen science initiatives in quite a lot of the work that we do.
Is there a risk that you then start to over-rely on that resource to fill data gaps that you might not be resourced or able to do yourselves as the regulator?
There is a risk. We are absolutely committed to doing the monitoring that we have to do by statute. There are a number of different regulatory regimes that require us to take measurements to enable us to manage the environment properly, and we take that very seriously. This year, give or take, we will probably take 90,000 samples. So it's a huge programme. Probably over 2 million different measurements of just the water environment, because it is so big and complicated. So we take it very seriously. There is always more you could do, and I think what was very telling listening to the interview was how citizen scientists can really get into those local situations, especially where the problems are diffuse, like septic tanks. It's really hard if you've got single Environment Agency officers to do that level of detail. Citizen scientists can really help us out there. So there is a danger if you start to rely, but I don't think our approach to citizen science is getting us anywhere near to that danger point, and actually we want to create this complementary system. Also, what I'm really keen to do, and it was great to hear it being mentioned, is to link the different methodologies that the citizen scientists can use with the sort of lab-based methodologies that legislation requires us to use, and to really understand how those two go together. Because again, going back to what we said at the beginning, understanding how the data is collected makes it more powerful, because then you can integrate it and use it together.
One of the things I took away from the interview with Michelle and Sasha was actually they can monitor beyond regulatory parameters. So as a regulator, you monitor the things that are in the regulations. Sasha talked to think about caffeine, for example, in the rivers, and the impact that caffeine has on fish and pharmaceuticals and things that might not be in our current legislation. Is there any role, do you think, for citizen science to help influence or shape future policy or regulation?
It's interesting, actually. The chemicals issue is fascinating, because actually we monitor well over 1,600 different chemicals in the environment. And we have an early warning system where we're looking for those chemicals that might be becoming an issue in the environment, because the chemical industries change all the time. So caffeine is on our watch list. We absolutely see that it's in many rivers, and indeed the latest reports from Europe show just how many rivers caffeine is in. But there are many other chemicals out there that we are looking at. Of course, the great thing about citizen science is, if it's done well, yes, it can help us to extend that reach, to look at some of the things. If people are finding them at levels which might be concerning, then we can add those to our early warning system and put it through the system and see if there's anything that we need to do about it. So it's another example of extending our view. We have a view, it's quite extensive. The labs down at Star Cross that the Environment Agency runs have some fantastic technicians who can do amazing things to find chemicals and break down products of chemicals and really understand how they are in the water. But that ability to take more samples, to look wider, is going to be a great way of complementing that overall early warning system.
You'll have this kind of overview of much of the agency's work. Have you seen any examples where citizen science has really had a positive impact?
One thing that I was really lucky to see when I was first starting in this role, I went down to the southwest and I was introduced to some of the work that we do around invertebrate monitoring. Now, invertebrates in the water, bugs in the water, are really good ways of seeing how healthy that stream is. And they change quite quickly. So if there's a problem, it's quite a good way of spotting that change. One of the examples I really liked was the work that was being done with the Riverfly partnership to take what, for the Environment Agency, is a very complicated, detailed survey of those bugs and turn it into something that people could do themselves, but was linked very closely to the methods that we use. Because then you could extend that window of viewing in a way that was robust, provided really useful information, but was much more applicable to people. You didn't have to take the samples back to a lab, etc. And I thought that was a really nice example of where people have said, we want to help, and we want to know how to help, and we're interested and we're willing to train ourselves up. How can we do that? And we work together to produce these different protocols. And it's examples like that, I think, that really show not only the passion of the citizen scientists that we have out there, but the real benefits of then coming and working together so that we can make best use of the data and actually start to use it in tracking pollution and in making decisions in the environment.
So Rob, final question, and you know what's coming because I ask all my guests this. I'm going to pass you the Planet Possible magic wand. Give it a wave, and given all the things we've talked about, what would you like to make possible in this space?
I'm always really keen, as you might expect of being the chief scientist, I'm always really keen on innovation. I'm always looking for the next way of doing things. And what I would love with a magic wand would be some new ways of seeing the environment, which enables us to get the information we need at a bigger scale, more quickly and more easily, without necessarily having to go to every place and monitor a number of times. Because our environment's changing. The climate is changing, population is changing, our environment's changing around us. We need to keep up, we need to be able to understand that change. And to do that, we are investing millions in new programs like the Natural Capital and Ecosystem Assessment to see that environment in a different way. But what we really need is these new technologies to come online to help us and to help everyone who's out there who's interested in the environment to take better measurements and really get into understanding what is happening in the environment so that we can keep up with that change and we can manage our environment to improve it for future generations. So that would be my magic wand. And, you know, we're working on it. We're working with the Natural Environment Research Council, putting in lots of money to see if we can stimulate lots of different companies to do that. But that would be one thing that would really be a huge change for good.
I love that. And I love the fact as a regulator, you're really pushing innovation. I think that's really important, isn't it? I think it needs to be leading, not following. So it's great to hear. Rob, thank you. As ever, time has flown by, always does. We're here at the end of another episode of Planet Possible. Thank you for joining us. I hope you found the conversation insightful. I hope it's given you something to think about in your world. You can subscribe to Planet Possible on your usual podcast player to never miss an episode. And we always love to hear your ratings and reviews too. As you'd expect, we've got even more fantastic guests and topics lined up for the rest of this year. So I really hope you'll join us for those. All that leaves me to say is a huge thank you to my superb guests, Sasha Woods, Michelle Walker, and my co-host, Dr. Rob Bradburn. So thank you, Rob, for joining us. That's it, everyone. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time.